Good morning. My name is Emily Glassman, and I'll be presenting on early maladaptive schemas as predictors of perceived social support in the church. If you think about your life, it's difficult to imagine not receiving support at various times throughout it. And as healthy individuals, we're able to recognize when support is being given and when it's needed. But sometimes we encounter things in our childhood or adolescence that make it difficult for us to recognize that support, or often the things we've gone through are so severe that people don't know how to give support in a way that's perceived as meaningful. And so I wanted to look to see what kind of goes into all of that. Dysfunction in childhood relating to the nuclear family can impact one's personality, and these researchers emphasize the use of the church as a surrogate family to fill that void of what was lacking in adolescence. According to Nooney and Woodrum, belief systems can be impacted by the social aspect of religion. And so, given what's presented in this literature, religious support can be a component present in one's behaviors and beliefs, and perhaps even beliefs about oneself. Speaking of beliefs about oneself, I wanted to talk about early maladaptive schemas. There are frameworks that develop in adolescence that can influence the interpretation of the world and how one perceives themselves relative to the world. They can be positive or negative, but for the purpose of this study, we're focusing on the negative or maladaptive ones, and they're stable. They remain consistent over time. Jeffrey Young, the founder of schema theory, categorized 18 individual early maladaptive schemas, as you see to the right, into 5 different domains. The first domain of disconnection and rejection can be defined as one's environment being rejecting or explosive, so the individual is not feeling like properly cared for. The second, impaired autonomy and performance. The environment that someone was raised in may have been overprotective, and there is an emphasis on dependence. The third is impaired limits. Someone in this environment may have been lacking supervision, so they did not quite develop that sense of responsibility to others. The third is other directedness. In this environment, someone may have felt the need to be neglectful or suppressant of their own needs in order to seek approval. And the fifth is overvigilance and inhibition. This environment was very perfectionistic with an emphasis on duty and performance in a punitive way. The severity level of a schema determines its disruptiveness in daily life. Behavior is not the schema, but schemas can influence behavior. And in schema therapy, there's an emphasis on the client-therapist alliance in treatment with a huge nurture and support component. Connection, support, and healthy relationships are important for one with strong early maladaptive schemas. And early maladaptive schemas are said to underlie mental illness. And so I kind of wanted to look into see how support can be given outside of that therapeutic alliance, since someone can't just be in therapy all the time. And so I focused primarily on the church because 4 out of 10 congregation members seek guidance from clergy when distressed. Higher religious involvement led to greater report of feeling cared for. And when spiritual support was present, people were more likely to utilize religious coping. And so the research suggests that the church may influence behavior outside of the church. And so I wanted to know, or support within the church influences behavior outside of the church. And so I want to know kind of what happens when you aren't able to recognize that support so much. So my first hypothesis was the greater the early maladaptive scores, the lower the perceived social support scores in these 4 schema domains. I left out the impaired limits schema domain, and I did not think it would predict lower levels of perceived social support just due to the emphasis on lack of responsibility to others. For my instruments, I was not able to access Jeffrey Young's schema questionnaire due to copyright issues, so I had to find another schema questionnaire. So I used the Dusseldorf Illustrated Schema Questionnaire for Children, but it still assessed all 18 individual schemas. There were 36 items, and it was on a 1 to 4 self-report scale, 1 being always, 4 being never. These are some examples of those items. I will pause so you can read. I also used the multidimensional scale of perceived social support. It had 12 items and was on a 1 to 7 Likert scale, 1 being very strongly disagree, 7 being very strongly agree. And I modified it and substituted the words family and friends for church congregation just to assess specifically support in the church congregation. I recruited 120 participants from 3 different churches surrounding the Midwest area. The churches were predominantly Church of God and Apostolic Pentecostal, but within those churches, there were some that fell into other denominations. 82 of my participants were female and 31 were male, and they were offered an incentive for a $25 Amazon gift card drawing. I also assessed religious involvement, as you can see here, and I basically did this to see if the population I was sampling was representative of people who actually expose themselves to church congregation. And this was successful because 55% reported only going once a week, and then 34% reported going more than once a week. So that only left 11% representing a few times a month and a few times a year. I first received approval from the Human Participants Committee, and then on my online survey, I was given informed consent by my participants, where they were given demographics and then taken to both the instruments. And then they were directed to a thank you page where they were given the opportunity to send an email to enter the gift card drawing. For my analyses, I first ran a correlation matrix to see which of the 18 individual schemas significantly correlated with perceived social support. And of these 18, you can see which domains they fall into to the left. And of the 18, only 4 were significant. So the abandonment and emotional deprivation schemas represented the disconnection rejection domain. Enmeshment and undeveloped self represented impaired autonomy and performance. And then self-sacrifice represented other directedness. And so I want to point out while we're on this slide that my second hypothesis was fully supported, that the impaired limits domain would not be significant. So with these 4 that were significant, I ran a multiple regression to see which were predictors of perceived social support. And of the 4, only emotional deprivation was a significant predictor of perceived social support, explaining 12% of the variance, which partially supported my hypothesis that the higher the maladaptive schema, the lower the perceived social support, and then fully supported my hypothesis and the impaired limit schema domain would not be represented, as I said earlier. So in conclusion, although only the emotional deprivation schema was a significant predictor of social support, there are still significant relationships between some early maladaptive schemas and perceived social support. And so if you're wondering why emotional deprivation, I was too. And so I looked further into the definition of it, and it's defined as the belief one's desire for a normal degree of emotional support will not be met by others. And I was like, oh, that's the whole purpose of this study. And so I looked into it even further, and that can be broken down into 3 different types of deprivation. Deprivation of nurturance, so someone had like the absence of warmth or companionship. Deprivation of empathy, so they experience the absence of someone who listened or mutual sharing of feelings. And then absence of protection, so someone may have experienced the absence of like direction or guidance from others. For my limitations, I want to own that it was not a very diverse population, both in denomination variety and in race and ethnicity. I had about 112 Caucasian to 8 that fit into other. And so it wasn't really even worth putting a pie chart on. The schema measure, of course, was typically designed for children, although I think that was also useful because then the wording was the wording was easy to understand to everybody. And then, of course, administration, I was not there. It was an online survey, and I have no way of knowing whether or not people chose to answer honestly. Some ideas for future research, schemas. It would be interesting if schemas were research predicting perceived social support in general, not just in the church. And then researching individual schemas, particularly emotional deprivation, would be interesting since that was the only one that was found significant. And then a replication of different instruments. So what to take away? The results suggest that not all schemas are the same, which aids more support to schema theory. And perhaps churches can focus on offering companionship, listening, mutual self-disclosure, and guidance or mentorship to help with this emotional deprivation schema that is represented. These are my references.